Good afternoon, everyone. We're going to get started as we do on time. So quickly before I announce today's speaker, I just want to get a couple of things on your mental radar. First, this evening between 5 and 6:30, we'll have our first Africa talk by Tanashi Hofisi, who'll be speaking about the elections in Zimbabwe. That's going to be held at the UW South Partnership on Park Street across from the library. And just a reminder that this is a series of talks we're inaugurating, celebrate 50 years of Africa at Noon by taking the scholarship of our graduate students out into the community. And we would love to see all of you there, both to support that initiative and to support our amazing graduate students. So tonight is the first one, and we'll hope to see you there. Next week in this spot, we'll have Dr. Oyewale Tamari, who is a medical doctor who's going to be talking about vaccine development on the continent. But today we have Dr. Elisa Scaraggi. She is here as a visiting postdoctoral fellow. She is the Marie Sklodowska-Curie Fellow at the Institute for Contemporary History at the new university in Lisbon, in the School of Social Sciences and Humanities there. But she's spending a year with us working on this project. She received her PhD in comparative studies and is trained in literary studies as much as in historical studies from the University of Lisbon in 2020. And her dissertation explored the entanglement between personal experiences and collective life in the diaries of the Angolan writer José Luandino Vieira, who was in prison for a very long time by the Portuguese colonial regime. Her current research for the Curie Fellowship and the work that she's doing here with us at Madison focuses on the personal archive of the Angolan intellectual Mario Pinto de Andrade, and the ways in which that personal archive is key to uncovering new narratives about Angola's recent past and the relationship between culture and nationalism, subjects near and dear to my heart. And Dr. Scaraggi is also very quickly moved from working on one writer, José Luandino Vieira, to working on this nationalist, intellectual, and political thinker. That's probably not what she's going to talk to you about today, but if you ever need to learn anything about how to quickly change your research because of extenuating circumstances that have nothing to do with you, she's a person to speak to. So, Dr. Scaraggi.
Thank you, Marisa. And let me say I'm really honored to be here, and I really hope I will keep up the level of the Africa at Noon folks. And also, I'm a little nervous, so I will read today. And during my talk today, I would like to present my ongoing research into the personal archive of Angolan intellectual Mario Pinto de Andrade. I will divide the talk in 3 parts. First, I will introduce the figure of Mario Pinto de Andrade. Then I will talk about his personal archive and how I organized my work during the months I spent at the archive. And finally, I will point out some among the multiple possibilities for research that emerged from my investigation and present some of the work that I intend to do during the following months. And I will start by introducing Mario Pinto de Andrade, for those who are not familiar with this figure. So Mario Pinto de Andrade had a very eventful life, and if I were to make a detailed account of his life, it would take me the whole hour. So let me introduce him very, very briefly. He was a sociologist, a literary critic, a poet, an editor of poetry, a translator, and a disseminator of African culture. His intellectual and cultural work cannot be separated from his political engagement and his struggle for the liberation of Portuguese colonies in Africa. Born in a rural area of Angola in 1928, he spent his childhood in Luanda, in a family that was part of what he called the Angolan lumpen aristocracy. That is, a small minority of non-whites who had historically enjoyed a relatively comfortable position in colonial society, but that during the course of the 20th century was progressively losing its privileges. Nevertheless, unlike many other non-whites, he had the opportunity to receive a good education. He was sent at the seminary. Here's a picture of him and his brother Joaquim who will also become an important figure of Angolan nationalism. After the seminary, he moved to Lisbon to attend university, where he stayed from 1948 to 1953. In Lisbon, with a group of students coming from Angola and other Portuguese colonies, he began his path towards a re-Africanization of his spirit, to use an expression by his friend and comrade, Amílcar Cabral. He participated in the activities of the Casa dos Estudantes do Império, the House of the Students of the Empire. That was an institution created by the Portuguese government that later turned into a hub for anti-colonial sentiments. While he was in Lisbon, he also founded a clandestine Center for African Studies in 1951. And he was only 25 when, together with the poet from São Tomé, Francisco José Tenreiro, he published the first anthology of poems by African writers of his expression. And in his archive of the anthology. In the following decades, he published several other anthologies of poetry in different countries and in different languages, always with the aim of disseminating the work of African poets and with it their message of cultural and subsequently political independence. And these are just some of the anthologies that he published. It is important to remember that Portugal was ruled at the time by an authoritarian regime called the Estado Novo, the new state, and that in that context, even gathering to study or publishing poetry could be regarded as subversive activity. Mario was forced to leave Portugal and self-exile to France in 1954. In Paris, he worked as editor for the well-known review Présence Africaine. And in the following years, he published several articles for Présence Africaine, as well as translations of Angolan authors that could not be published in Portugal or Angola because of censorship. And I've collected here some of the articles he published on Présence Africaine. Working for this review, he met some among the most prominent African intellectuals of the time, such as Léopold Senghor, Aimé Césaire, and Frantz Fanon. He also met Sarah Maldoror, at that time an actor and activist who became his partner and the mother of his two children. She later became a filmmaker and was one of the first Black women to make cinema in Africa. So Mario's cultural work had always had strong political implications, but he passed to direct political action in the 60s, when it became clear that the Portuguese regime would not withdraw. He was among the founders of one of the Angolan liberation movements that were fighting against Portuguese colonialism, the MPLA, the Popular Movement for the Liberation of Angola, and he served as its president from 1960 to 1962. Because of the extensive international network that he had cultivated over the years, and thanks to his natural ability as a diplomat, he was in charge of the MPLA's foreign relations. Here, for example, you have a picture of him with the president of Algeria. Moreover, the numerous books, articles, and essays that he published in Africa, Europe, and the Americas contributed to gather widespread international support for the movement. However, his relationship with the MPLA wasn't always straightforward. He left the movement for the first time in 1963 in disagreement with the political choices made by the president who replaced him, Agostinho Neto. Mario went back to the MPLA soon after, but relations tense until the second big 1974, so-called Revolt Activa, the active revolt, a dissident faction that asked for a democratization of change in its power structure. After Angola's independence in 1975, the Revolt Activa was ostracized, many of its members persecuted and arrested, and Mario had to leave the country to never return. As a sort of retaliation, after his death in 1990, and until quite recently, his contribution to the Angolan National Project has been largely by the official narrative of the movement. Just remember that the MPLA is still in power since Angola's independence in 1974. But Mario Pinto de Andrade political action was not limited to the MPLA. He was involved in the foundation of different transnational organizations, such as the CONCEP, the Conference of Nationalist Organizations of the Portuguese Studies, the Portuguese colonies, sorry, that promoted the principle of collective action and solidarity among different liberation movements. And he was also an active member of the PAIGC, the African Party for the Independence of Guinea and Cabo Verde, led by Amílcar Cabral. So when he had to leave Angola after the independence, he became Minister of Culture in Guinea-Bissau. In his late years, he worked as a consultant in education and culture for UNESCO. He collaborated with the Center for African Studies of the University of Maputo in Mozambique, as well as with different cultural organizations, both in Europe and in Africa. He was also enrolled in a PhD at the EHESS, the School for Advanced Studies in the Social Sciences in Paris, where he was preparing a dissertation on the origins of African nationalism. He died before he was able to finish his work, but the drafts of his dissertations were published posthumously and have recently been translated into English in a book that has been named one of Africa's 100 best books of the 20th century. So after this brief outline of his biography, I think it's no surprise to hear that since it has been made public, his personal archive has been a great resource for different research on the history of the liberation struggles, but also on the many international implications of these struggles. What I think is the peculiarity of my own research is that it looks at the archive not just as a source of information, but as part of the information itself. I am interested in how the archive is organized, in what it contains and in what it does not contain. I'm also interested in understanding how Mario built, preserved, and used the archive over time. And according to an interview that he gave to French researcher Michel Laban, when he was a child in Luanda, Mario Pinto de Andrade was tasked by his father to arrange and keep in order his family's documents. From a very young age then, he engaged in practices of record keeping and became aware of the value of this practice. In Andrade's archive, I found a letter that he sent to his eldest daughter, Anushka, in 1988, in which he asked her to store his documents in a room while he's away, referring to these documents as to the temple of my life, and referring to his daughters as to the guardian of the temple. And when I spoke to Anushka about this letter, she told me that there was another letter in which he called her La gardienne de mes utopies, the guardian of my utopias. This choice of words reveals the importance and the almost sacred value that he gave to the documents he gathered throughout his life. And I had the privilege to spend approximately 6 months at the Mario Soares Foundation in Lisbon, where the archive is currently hosted. During this time, I got to know a little about the temple of Andrade's life and about Mario himself. And just 2 words about the history of the archive. Most records were deposited by his daughters, who are the heirs and the owners of the archive. They deposited the first 480 folders in 1998 at the Foundation Mario Soares. And each folder contains a variable number of documents from 1 to more than 100. Another 150 folders were deposited at a later time, between 2005 and 2013. And as of today, there is still an imprecise number of folders that have not been deposited nor made public, and that are kept by Andrade's daughters in Paris. However, the Mario Soares Foundation hosts the largest part of Mario de Andrade's archive, together with several other archival funds that belong to people who took part in the struggle against fascism and colonialism in Portugal. The foundation has done an amazing job by digitizing thousands of these records and making them available online, allowing researchers from all over the world to access this material without restrictions related to geography or financial resources. And I wanted to show you the website of the foundation. So this is the website. It's called Casa Común, the common house. Here on the left, you see the different archival fonts. As you can see, you also have the archive of Amilcar Cabral. And here, if we scroll to the here, Mario Pinto de Andrade, we get to the main page of Mario Pinto de Andrade online archive. So as I said, the foundation has done an amazing job by digitizing all of this material, but using the digital archive only has some limitations, especially for someone like me, who is not looking for a specific record, but is trying to grasp the logics behind the archive. So as you can see here, documents have been grouped thematically or chronologically into different categories. We have youth, African affirmation, militant action, liberation struggle, and so on. If we click on each one of these categories, for example, African affirmation, we get to subcategories. We have Conference of Afro-Asiatic Writers, investigation and text, for example. And this choice of classification reflects choices made by archivists with the intent of making the website more user-friendly. But it's not clear which criteria have been used to group documents together and put them under a certain category rather than. So why a text with no date has been put under African affirmation and not militant action. Another problem maybe you can already identify is the quality of digital documents. As I said, the first deposit was made in 1998, and the work of digitization and publication online started in the early 2000s, when technology was quite different from what we have now. So the result is that the quality of images is very uneven, and it depends on when the document was digitized. So as you can see, we have documents that are barely readable or not readable at all, and then we have other documents that are perfectly reproduced. So the website is certainly a great resource, and for me it has been extremely useful, and it will be even more useful now that I'm not in Lisbon anymore. But the possibility to access the physical records has been really crucial for my work. And not only because I could avoid the problems that I've pointed out, but also because I believe that the materiality of the archive determined the way in which I engage with it. One way in which I have used the website has been to map the contents of the archive and identify which documents I wanted to work with. So I said there are more than 600 folders in the archive. So since the beginning, I knew that I would not have the time to see them all. And I had to find a way to select the ones I wanted to work with. And let me show you how I worked. So as you can see, each document has a unique identifier assigned to it. And this identifier, the first part, corresponds to the folder in which the document is placed. And the second part, like this 001, corresponds to the sequence of documents in that folder. So if we take this first part of the identifier, we put it in the search bar, followed by an asterisk, we can see all the documents that are in one specific folder. So with this information taken from the website, I have constructed a database that lists all the folders in the archive, and that I'll show you quickly. So here I list all the folders, very extensive. And then I have different categories, I have different columns. One, for example, for dates, one with keywords. For example, I list all the names that are mentioned in a specific record in a specific folder. And then I have another column for transcription, if I have made or I need to make transcription, and so on. So this database helps me to keep track of the work I've done so far, but it also allows me to reconstruct the original order in which the material arrived at the foundation. And I insist on this principle of original order because it serves as a means for understanding personal records in all of their complexity. It serves as a means to identify the creative processes through which the creator of the archive carried out his work and understand the relationship that contextualized the record. And let me give you a concrete example taken from a true story. On the website, all the letters are grouped under a category that is correspondence. And they are listed here by the name of the sender. So imagine finding here a letter where someone says, about that book project we talked. And if I take this letter by itself, I have little means to know what book they are referring to. But if instead I see the letter in the folder where it was originally placed, together with other documents that refer to that project, I have the contextual information that allows me to identify the book they are talking about. And I will go back here to the PowerPoint. So after this introduction about the methodology that I followed so far, I will go on and go into more details about some of the things that I found in the archive and on which I would like to work during my postdoc. I want to stress that these are just some of the many fascinating things that I found and that I wouldn't have time to show them all. So during a conversation that I had with Andrade's daughter, Anushka, she told me that her father never left the house without carrying a note with him in case he needed to take some notes or decided to sit in a cafe and work from there. And in the archive, I have found many of these notebooks. Here, I collected just some of the covers. Some of these notebooks contain a series of reading notes about books and articles that he was reading. And through these notes, we can see what he was reading and understand how these readings influenced his own thought. Other notebooks contain drafts of essays on a series of different subjects. And just to give you an idea of the variety, I found a study on the Kimbundo language, for example, another study about the development of the nationalist struggle in the Portuguese colonies, another one on exotism and folklore in Angola, etc. Some of these drafts have been later developed and published. For example, this one about the political thought of Amílcar Cabral constitutes the base for a book that Mario published on the political trajectory of Cabral. It was published then in 1980 for a French publishing house. Other essays, however, have never been published. For example, there is this very interesting text titled On Some Incorrect Ideas on the Liberation Movement in Angola, in which Mario de Andrade goes through the works written by historians John Markham, Douglas Wheeler, and René Passier, works that became classics of the literature on the Angolan liberation struggle, and he criticizes them according to his own studies and according to his own personal experience. And my idea is to fully transcribe these essays and then choose the ones that are best suited to be edited and made public. Among the notebooks that I found, there are some that refer to a specific experience on which I want to go more in depth. And I am referring to Mario's short stay in a guerrilla base on the Eastern Front, close to the border with Zambia, in what the MPLA called the third political military region. And to contextualize here, the MPLA opened the first and second military region in 1961 when the armed struggle began, and then in 1964 in the northern part of the country, at the border with the Republic of the Congo, Leopoldville, as it was known at the time, and in Cabinda, an exclave in the north. The Eastern Front was opened in 1966 after Zambia's independence, and it was the only front that saw considerable results in terms of military success. And here you have a map, the political military regions of the MPLA. You can also see the approximate location of the base where Mario was staying. So the enthusiasm for the success on the Eastern Front prompted Agostinho Neto, president of the MPLA, to launch a new directive in 1968 that is commonly summed up in the slogan, "Everyone to the interior." And it was a call to militants that were in the headquarters of Brazzaville or Algiers or anywhere else to join the guerrilla inside of Angola. And it appears that Mario was reticent to comply to this directive for several reasons. First, his health was fragile, and he was probably afraid of not being able to stand the harsh living conditions of the guerrilla. Second, I found letters in which he spoke quite frankly to the direction of the MPLA about his material situation, the need to have a paying job to support his family. And remember that his partner was a filmmaker, an artist, which means that ultimately she didn't have a stable source of income. Finally, and probably most importantly, different sources testify that Mario had never made a secret of being essentially an intellectual who had not much interest in participating in the military side of the war. He had dedicated his life to the struggle and worked hard for the movement, but he had always conceived his work on the level of political and cultural diplomacy. However, in the context of the armed struggle, legitimacy was acquired primarily through military action, and intellectuals in general were not held in high consideration. They were considered an elite distant from the masses and accused of not giving any real contribution to the advancement of the struggle. So eventually, Mario joined the guerrilla in the interior of Angola. He arrived at the base called Kiteshe 2, Kiteshe 2, and stayed there for a few months, from what I could understand from approximately July to December 1971. Upon his arrival, he had to adopt a war name, and he chose Ukamba, a word that means friendship in Kimbundo. And I think it was an appropriate name for Mario because many people told me that he was very friendly and easy to be around. And I think this is confirmed by the many letters that are in his archive, letters that a few guerrilla fighters that he met on the front then sent him to update him on their lives, tell him about their experiences, exchange news, or also ask for basic items such as sugar, tobacco, etc. And we have a few pictures of Mario at the base, and among these pictures, we have some of him posing as a guerrilla fighter. For example, this one that has an inscription on the back that reads, "For Anushka, souvenir of her dad, a revolutionary fighter." But someone told me that you can see from this picture that it was clearly useless with weapons because this is not how you should hold a rifle. And the work that he did at the base, fortunately, didn't involve weapons. And a little archival note here before going on. All the material that I'm showing now, I found it in just one big folder in which Mario himself had arranged records related to his stay in Kiteshe in 1983. So this also gives us an idea of how he was constantly going back to his archive, rearranging records and reusing them. But finally, what do we find in this folder? First, we have a series of interviews that he conducted with low-grade guerrilla fighters, and he wanted to know about their experience from their own voices. He wanted to know when they first heard about the MPLA, why they decided to join the struggle, what they were doing before joining the struggle, and so on. There are also interviews with civilians, with villagers, and we also have some pictures of these people. So Mario appears very aware of the importance of the villagers for the very existence of the guerrilla. It was them who provided for the food. It was them who knew the territory and knew which routes were the safest in the channels, in the grassland that characterized the region. And these territories at the far east of Angola were often called the lands at the end of the world. In the most remote areas, there were villages that did not have any relation with the colonizers until the beginning of the anti-colonial war. So this means that this region had also received less attention from scholars if we compare it, for example, with the coastal areas of Angola. So Mario then begins to study the background of this region. And another thing that we find in this folder are the records that he accumulated about the history of the Muda people, also called the Ovimbundu, their language, their folklore, the territory. I also found a map that he drew, historical map of the Bunda country. Another thing that I found and that I find really interesting, it's drafts of another essay that he was writing while he was at the base, and that is titled Sociologia da Guerra, Sociology of the War. And it's an essay based on the interviews he conducted, his observations on the field, and his readings about the history of the region. So the aim of this essay is studying the impact that the armed struggle has on the people living in the region, how the arrival of the war transformed and sometimes destroyed traditional economical and social structures. And again, here, Mario shows an interest for the local population that goes beyond the heroic but sometimes void rhetoric of the liberation war. And during the time he stayed at the base, he was in charge of the ideological formation of the guerrilla fighters. So we also have other records, other notebooks that testify of the debates they had, of their meetings, etc. And I noticed that many of these discussions focused on problems such as the hierarchy inside the movement, as well as on the perception of some concepts such as tribe, ethnic group, race, and nation. And why is this important? So the official discourse of the MPLA said that the movement was against any form of racism and tribalism. But this does not mean that there weren't conflicts based on ethnic tensions. Actually, the ethnic issue on the Eastern Front was quite serious. The officials who occupied the highest positions were mostly people who came from the northern areas of the country and had acquired some military experience in the first and second military region. But these people accumulated more and more privileges. And as they committed systematic abuses of power, local militants and civilians turned against them, and they started to perceive them as foreign occupants who didn't speak the local language and belonged to different ethnic groups. In 1969, just 2 years before Mario went to the base, on the Eastern Front, we see the first big internal manifestation of dissent within the MPLA. It was a protest that mobilized a great number of locals, but that eventually was sedated and didn't achieve any significant result. And I think it's worth noting that among the interviews conducted by Mario, there is one to Jiboya, who was the leader of this protest. And it's also worth mentioning that the MPLA didn't really address the problem of these ethnic tensions. So a few years later, a stronger dissident movement grew on the Eastern Front and had a substantial impact for the future of the movement. But this is another story. What we see from Mario's note is that instead of ignoring the question, instead of ignoring these tensions or treating the ethnic issue as a dogma, it tries to analyze it with the guerrilla fighters, trying to bring everyone to a common ground. And let's say from a scientific point of view, because essentially it was a researcher, a scientist. The last record that I wanted to mention here is a diary that Mario wrote while he was on the Eastern Front, and that gives us a more intimate perspective about his time there. So again, with all of this material, what I want to do is to get it transcribed and so more easily accessible, so that I can go deeper into Mario's experience on the Eastern Front, which is something that has not been studied before, as far as I know of. And about this experience, I've heard rumors that there is more material kept by his daughters in Paris. So I will try to negotiate with them some kind of access to this material to have a more complete picture of this experience. And I wanted to make a little note about Mario's daughters. Both have been committed to restoring the memory of their father, whose importance, as I said earlier, has largely been diminished. When I approached them at the beginning of my project to ask them their authorization to go ahead, they welcomed my project and they were very open and kind to me. At the same time, they said that they preferred that I focus on certain aspects rather than others. And here I won't enter into details, but I just wanted to say something that maybe is obvious, but I think it's important to remember it. When working with personal archives, things really get personal. There are feelings, memories, traumas, and certainly many expectations involved. So I believe that researchers working with such delicate issues should try their best to respect the sensitivities of people who are emotionally involved, while at the same time trying to keep their research independent and avoid self-censorship. So it's not always easy, but I think it's necessary to try. And speaking about personal connections to the archive, I will pass to the last point of my presentation. So one of the developments of my work in the archive is to involve in my project people that have personal connections to some of the records. I think that this can be a way to get at more personal narratives about Mario de Andrade, but also a means to have different people engaging with the archive and giving a new life to the archive. My plan is to get in touch with people whose traces I find in the archive and interview them about their relationship with Mario, but also more generally about their involvement in the struggle. And when I meet them, I also ask them if they have kept records, if they have letters that they received by Mario, from Mario, for example, and if they are willing to share them. This turned out to be more difficult than I thought, because many of the people who were writing to Mario, if they are still alive, they are quite old. They're not always good with technology, so interviewing them with Zoom, for example, is quite complicated. And interviewing them in person is also complicated because many live in different places, in different continents. Moreover, the people who have been able to get in touch with lived some quite troubled lives. Many have been in exile or in the guerrilla or in prison or a combination of all this. So they have not kept many records dating back to that time. As of today, I have interviewed only a few people, and just 2 of them agreed to be recorded or filmed. One of them was the Angola musician Bonga, that I contacted because I found a mysterious note dating from 1973, where he said to Mario, "I need to speak to you urgently." And when I asked him about this note, of course, he didn't remember. But then we spoke about their relationship and about the song Muimbu Wasabalu, which is based on a poem that Mario wrote in Kipundu. Bonga put it into music, and it's included in the most important, at least historically, album by Bonga, that's Angola 72, Angola 72. I also conducted 2 interviews with Manuel Videira, who is a former militant of the MPLA and was quite close to Mario, and shared with him also the experience of the political dissidents inside the MPLA. In the archive, there are many records that mention him or that are directly produced by him, some letters, some reports of political meetings, etc. And as he was staying in Lisbon during the summer, he was able to come to the archive and see the documents for himself. And it was very interesting and also very touching to see his reactions when reading documents that he had not seen in over 50 years. So now I have a list of people who I want to get in touch with, and I will try to do so during the next months. Some of these people are in Luanda, where I have never been, and that I hope to visit by the end of spring. Once I have collected a certain number of interviews, I will upload selected excerpts on a website that I also will hopefully start to prepare soon. So as you can see, I have a lot of work to do. And I'm really happy to be able to do part of this work here in Madison, where I can count on such a vibrant community of scholars and students. Thank you.